Most people in the weird world in the West have been traumatized by what often passes for science. It's used as this weapon of blunt force. Scientists, including evolutionary biologists, like to make statements and just expect you to believe them. You shouldn't just accept it because I'm up here and I have a PhD. And you can't have consilience between different kinds of evidence if you only have one kind of evidence. It's the kind of mistake that the reductionist, mechanistic, data-driven, pseudo, if I may, scientific investigations that many are involved in now are making. I would like to argue that that is not science. That's not science that is being taught that way, that is being wielded that way. Do the fittest actually survive? And if so, what makes an organism most fit? And how can we all get there? Given your particular sets of strengths and weaknesses, you may be on top at the moment, and that could change in a minute. I would like to take back science for the courageous and the creative and the curious. Science embraces uncertainty. It has to. Nothing is ever for sure.
What a pleasure it is to welcome you all here this evening. I'm Stephen Blackwood. I'm the president of this new college here in Savannah, Georgia, Ralston College. Our endeavor is to emulate the best universities in history. No small thing that is, but that is our aim. We have founded this college around 4 fundamental commitments: to seek the truth wherever it leads, to the freedoms you need to seek the truth: freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, to the pursuit of beauty in all of its forms, and to the fellowship or friendship, you might say, that is the context for pursuing those things together. We have one program so far. It's a 1-year graduate program called the Masters in the Humanities. Begins in Greece with 2 months of intensive study of the language of Greek, and then comes here to Savannah for the next 3 terms or quarters, where our students move or trace the history of the development of Western civilization and its ideals from ancient times through to the present. But we are not merely a college of so far a few here in Savannah. We endeavor to be a fellowship for anyone, anywhere, who seeks the truth with courage. We aim to throw open the doors of human inquiry to anyone, anywhere. And this lecture series tonight, our Sophia lectures, is one of the signal ways in which we have aimed to do so. This is the 3rd year of this annual series. In the first year, we had the theologian Douglas Headley speaking to us about the spirit of play. Last year, it was the neuroscientist and sort of legendary humanist Ian McGilchrist speaking about wholeness, imagination, and the cosmos. Both of those series you can now find online, I'm glad to say. And it is my great honor this evening to introduce this year's pair of lecturers who will be delivering this Sophia series. Brett Weinstein and Heather Hying are scientists, authors, scholars, and educators. For 15 years, they were tenured members of the faculty at Evergreen State College. They both hold undergraduate degrees from the University of California at Santa Cruz and PhDs in biology from the University of Michigan. I will not rehearse the story here of their departure from Evergreen, but it boils down to the refusal to back down. Refusal to back down from long-held intellectual principles, and a refusal to back down in the face of the mob. I hasten to add here, because this word mob can be used in all kinds of contexts, metaphorically and otherwise, this was no metaphorical mob, or merely, if we can say merely, once again, an online or verbal one. The threat of physical violence was shockingly real. Evergreen's loss, and what a loss it was, let me tell you. If you hear them speak about their teaching at Evergreen, their 11-week study with their students in Peru and elsewhere, what an unimaginable loss that was. Turned out to be to everyone else's gain. Brett and Heather have described themselves as professors in exile, a title that reveals as much about them as it does about our moment in time. Where is real learning, real inquiry, real knowledge, real conversation to be found? These two are now known to millions of people around the world for their bracing, fearless, long-form conversations, in particularly on their own show, the Dark Horse Podcast. They're also the authors together of a book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, Evolution and the Challenges of Modern Life, a treatment of the problem that they term, quote, hyper-novelty. They both write and publish elsewhere, Heather in particular, on her Substack, which I encourage you to look up, Natural Selections. But the drama surrounding their exit from that one particular institution and their entry into the public eye, a twist of fate, as I've suggested, for which we might all, in retrospect, be grateful, conceals a deep continuity in their careers. Although it is no exaggeration to say that one of them was quite literally chased off a campus. These professors in exile continue to pursue research, to teach, and to serve. If these professorial duties now take different forms, their ongoing contributions are unmistakable. Perhaps in particular, I should note that the podcast discussions they convened during the pandemic years were magnificent examples of the fearless pursuit of truth and an uncompromising commitment to share that pursuit with others. They gave invaluable service to the public at a vital moment of coercive pressure and contrived consensus. You might wonder, though, why is Ralston College, a humanities institution as it now stands in terms of our curriculum, having two evolutionary biologists in to speak at this Signal Lecture Series? Well, I'd like to say only two things about that. And the first, our students learn Greek while they're here. The first is that both Aristotle and Plato say something along the lines of philosophy begins in wonder. And I encourage you to think about what wonder is, that amazement, that how does that workness of our minds in relation to the world at large. So often, that wonder is at nature. The second point I'd like to make is a larger one about the university. What we now know as two cultures were not always so. In fact, many, if not most, of the great figures of the Western tradition, at least, would never have recognized that distinction. A figure like Boethius, for example, who's a great mathematician, a great musician, a great inventor, a great poet, a great philosopher. These things are all synthesized. Take Nicolas Dorem, for example, born in 1325 in Normandy, if I'm not mistaken. A great French philosopher of the Middle Ages, studied the so-called arts at Paris. And then in 1348, became a student of theology, a higher discipline in Paris. Then he got his doctorate in the same year, was appointed the Grand Master of the College of Navarre. So went the early biography of this figure, who later went on to write influential works in economics, mathematics, physics, where he laid the groundwork for the laws of motion later discovered by Galileo and Newton, astrology, astronomy, philosophy, theology, not to mention being the Bishop of Lisieux, a translator, a counselor to King Charles V of France, and one of the most original thinkers of 14th century Europe. The point I'm making is that the modern notion of the opposition between the sciences and the humanities is just that, a modern prejudice, supposition, that is, in fact, in the deepest sense, false. Brett and Heather represent the university and the universality of thinking that you can hear in that word university in the highest and best ways through their boundless curiosity, their fearless free inquiry. Their Sophia lectures at Ralston College thus mark, I like to think of it, at least for these few days, a kind of return to higher learning's institutional form. Welcome back, I'd like to say. But perhaps more fundamentally, these professors in exile were never exiled from what the convocation of one famous university calls the ancient and universal company of scholars. They remain, and they have always remained, in that community, which is the inalienable birthright of any thinking person, regardless of creed, religion, wealth, or position. They have remained in that, even as tonight they join our community here in Savannah to share their unique insights into what I know will prove a provocative, challenging, and ambitious intellectual adventure. Join me now in welcoming for the first of these Sophia lectures, Dr. Heather Hying.
That was an amazing introduction. Can you hear me? I don't feel like you can. You can. Ah, there it is. Thank you for that introduction, which you stole a lot of my thunder, I gotta say. We are delighted and honored to be here, and we see Ralston indeed as a continuation of something that is ancient and needs to be happening. And I was going to say precisely that the theme this year at Ralston is nature, and it's obvious why you would bring evolutionary biologists into the Sophia lectures when the theme is nature, but what of the more universal themes of Ralston? That of truth and free expression and beauty and fellowship. And I hope that you will find, as we are talking, first me and then Brett tonight, and again me and then Brett tomorrow, that three of those themes are really inherently part of an evolutionary understanding of the world. The truth and beauty and fellowship all have evolutionary relationships with one another, and you will see that intertwining in our talks. But what of free expression, free inquiry, freedom at all of its levels? And for that, I would say I hope that you hear things tonight from both of us and tomorrow that surprise you, that challenge you, that take you places maybe that you haven't thought about before, simply because you didn't think you were interested or you weren't exposed. But also, you may well hear things that don't feel right, either at an intellectual level or at a visceral level even. And that's all to the good, honestly. Because in an environment in which free inquiry is one of the foundational themes, we can, and hopefully we will have some time to explore in the Q&A after both of these evenings, and in some more informal time elsewhere, perhaps, discover why. If we disagree, is it simply miscommunication? That's possible. Am I standing someplace that you haven't been, and I can invite you in, and you can see from my eyes? Or conversely, are you standing someplace that I have never been? I haven't been able to get there, it hasn't occurred to me to go, and can you invite me in, and can I see from your eyes, and can we come to an understanding that didn't seem like an understanding? Or do we actually just disagree? Are we not seeing the world in the same way, and we can't find our way to be in the same place? Interesting if so. All true stories ultimately must reconcile. So what does that mean? Maybe we don't figure it out. Maybe sometimes we do, in fact, have to just say, we don't agree, we're not going to see eye to eye. But in an environment of free expression, we can take the time to find out, and it's safe, actually safe, to do so. So I'm just so grateful that Ralston is here doing what it's doing. So the title of our series is Tractable Miracles. The title of my first talk here is Foundations. And I'm going to take us through a few core themes in evolutionary biology: time and space, relationships and the nature of evidence, similarity and difference. What does it mean to be the same, evolutionarily speaking? Before ceding the floor to Brett. Tomorrow I'm going to delve more deeply into evolutionary realities that find their fullest instantiation in humans, but many of which you will find actually are found in other organisms on this planet as well. Things like childhood and play, architecture, theory of mind, love, and grief. But first, I want to begin with a story of the night sky, and of observation, and of wonder. A story that involved almost no words, actually, in the experiencing of it, but which requires words to tell, as most stories do. But I'm going to not yell at you with the words for the moment. and just let you enjoy the photograph as I tell the story. So Brett and I are blessed to live on an island off of the northwest coast of Washington State in an archipelago that is shared between the United States and Canada. It is utterly beautiful. Summers are crystalline and clear, but most of the other seasons have a tendency to be tempestuous with clouds and rain and wind. And yet, on one very late fall night last December, the day had been completely clear. There was nothing in the air, no water, no particulates at all. And while this is actually a photograph of dawn, because it's easier to take photographs to the east at dawn than it is to take photographs to the east at dusk, because given the way our Earth spins, we have the sun coming up in the east and also the moon coming up in the east. On this particular night, there was no moon, it was a new moon. But that means that not only does day rise in the east, but night rises in the east as well. We think of night falling, but when you're looking east, night rises. And we could see the far-off lights of the city on the mainland, looking towards the water and some other islands, the mainland, the mountains, a volcano, Mount Baker, and a few houses, a few lighthouses, lights from houses, planes in the sky. And as night fell, some satellites in the sky, and really all of the cosmos was on display as it got darker and darker. Just a crystalline clear night, but in almost the beginning of winter, so that it was quite dark. And we saw something on the horizon that hadn't been there before, a pale, flat disk. And we thought, oh, that's moving too slowly to be human-made. It's not a plane, it's not a satellite. And it's too bright to be a star, so it must be a planet. What planet it's going to be? It's too far from the horizon to be Mercury. It's too far from the sun to be Venus. It's not red enough to be Mars. Neptune and Uranus aren't visible with the naked eye. That leaves Jupiter or Saturn. And so we looked and we looked. And then we used some tools that we had, 10 by binoculars, to help us out. And it still just looked like a pale yellow flat disk. Indeed, in the early 1700s, Galileo first generated 20 by binoculars, and he was the first to see the moons of Jupiter, the so-called now Galilean moons, which have been named for the Jupiter's Greek counterpart, Zeus's lovers, Io, Ganymede, Europa, and I forgot the other one, Callisto, Callisto. So Galileo had been able to see them with magnification of 20 times. We only had 10 times. And we didn't want to look it up. And that's one of the themes of how we experience the world, honestly, is use what you have in your head and what you can see with your senses to try to understand before you refer to authorities, no matter how good you think they might be. So we sat there as the sky continued to get darker and darker, and we had a fire in the wood-burning stove. All the lights were off in the house, and we just watched it for hours. And at some point, binoculars to my eyes, I thought I saw a fatness at it and said, I see rings. It's going to be Saturn. And Brett said, no, I think I see moons. It's Jupiter. And we didn't look it up. I thought, well, we're both looking at exactly the same thing. We have exactly the same technology. We are human bodies using almost identical binoculars, and we could swap them and use exactly the same binoculars. We are seeing the same thing, and we have different interpretations of the same thing. And that's fine, but one of us was wrong. One of us had to be wrong, right? It wasn't both Jupiter and Saturn at the same time. We weren't seeing two planets, and one of us was looking at one, the other one was looking at the other. It was just one or the other. I just gave it away. I was always going to get there. The next morning we woke up, and the only planet still visible in the sky, the only planet still visible was not in the sky but underneath our feet. It was Earth. And everything else was blinded by the light of the day. And we looked it up. And it turns out that all of the planets have been visible in the night sky the night before. Neptune and Uranus only with binoculars. But Jupiter and Saturn had both been up, so had in the other direction, not the direction we were looking at, Mercury and Venus and Mars. But which one was this? It was, in fact, Jupiter. So Again, we were looking at the same thing, and we had different interpretations. And now that I knew what it was, it doesn't change what I saw. It changes my interpretation of what I saw, but what I saw remains the same. So I wrote this up and I put it out into the world. And one of the comments that came back to me was, if you get this great sky app, you'll never have to wonder again. And I responded, why would I ever want to reduce wonder? So very fitting with Dr. Blackwood's introduction. Why would I ever want to minimize wonder? And it is indeed one of the themes of a true scientific perspective on the world. So I tell this story in part so that you can be reassured that we are not those kinds of scientists, the ones who like to talk about data-driven and think that answers only come in the form of numbers and believe in certainty and would kind of feel like it'd be better if the people in charge were the ones with the credentials and the lab coats, and if we would all just listen to what they say. The ones who think that they're the embodiment of science. Well, I know that most people who don't think of themselves as scientists, as presumably, just given the demographics of America, probably most people in this room don't think of themselves as scientists. Most people in the weird world in the West have been traumatized by what often passes for science, right? It's used as this weapon of blunt force. And I would like to argue that that is not science. That is not science that is being taught that way, that is being wielded that way. I would like to take back science for the courageous and the creative and the curious, both the people who can be described that way and the inquiry that real science involves, because science embraces uncertainty. It has to. Nothing is ever for sure. And science leaves room indeed for wonder and for awe. So, let's talk a little bit about universals. The laws of physics and mathematics are discovered by humans, while the language and symbols that we use to describe them are, of course, our creations. We're discovering something real, and we're describing them with language and tools that we create. Hence for instance, very different but wholly consilient understandings of calculus that come down to us from Leibniz and Newton. Calculus exists with or without humans, and if there is other sentient life in the universe, which I hope and believe that there is, they will also be using calculus, although they may not recognize our calculus as such. It would probably take them some doing to figure out what we were doing with it. But calculus, therefore, the underlying reality of it, as opposed to our description of it, is not the product of evolution. That's not evolutionary. It does not describe an organic process. Just as this shell is the product of evolution, an organism once lived in it, but it is reflecting a universal, the Fibonacci sequence, the Fibonacci series, that will be universal across all places in the universe. Similarly, the elements that are described in the periodic table of elements, the periodic table itself is a human creation. And if there is other life in the universe that is sentient, it will have figured out these truths that are reflected here. But it may not, whatever they have done to create a reflection of the truths that they have seen that are universal, may well not look like this. Maybe they live in a world where vision is not their primary sense. Maybe the periodic table of elements in a different world isn't a visual graph at all. But it will reflect the same reality, such as, for instance, and I can't see it on my screen, but I know it's up there, 79. Number 79 is gold, which means that gold has 79 protons in it. And to its left is 78. If gold suddenly has 78 protons in it, it's not gold anymore. It's platinum. And if it has 80 protons in it, it's not gold anymore, it's mercury. That's just a reality of the universe. But gold is gold is gold, no matter where it is. But what we do with it, such as in this detail from the Catedral de Granada, where Brett and I just were lucky enough to be in Spain, what we do with it is very much a human creation, and therefore a product of evolution, because humans are the product of evolution. So that's where I'm going to go here. I want to show a few slides of things and ask you, are these products of evolution? And I'm going to do that before I define evolution. So it's maybe not completely fair, but here we go. This, which hopefully people can tell, are some rocks. Beautiful, beautiful rocks. Is this the product of evolution? It's not. Okay? Not to say that rocks that looked exactly like this would necessarily show up anywhere else, because the conditions that made them may be particular to this planet, but these are not evolutionary, they're not biotic, and therefore not evolutionary. How about this? This is water on the petals of a rose at the Portland Rose Garden one summer. The water is not the product of evolution. The water is not organic. Water will show up every place that the conditions are ready for it. It is not a particular. Roses are. The petals of a rose are indeed the product of evolution. They are a particular that emerges from the universals that exist. Sea stars? Yes, obviously, they have evolved. How about the sand that they're on? Well, as it turns out that a lot of the white sand in the kinds of places where these kinds of sea stars live are in fact the product of having passed through the digestive system of parrotfish. So it turns out maybe the sand is too. It seems like it wouldn't be. If it's pure silica, it's not, but it's a mixture. How about this? Quetzal this is not either of our photos, but in Guatemala, this is a gorgeous bird approaching a tree, both of which, of course, are indeed the products of evolution. How about these two handsome young men? These are our two sons many years ago. They are now quite a bit older than that, in the Amazon, where we took them because we're good parents. Having awe and wonder at the sheer size of the tree in this case. They weren't particularly tiny children. The trees in the Amazon are particularly large. Everything here in this picture, as far as I can tell, is the product of evolution, indeed. And how about this? Here's the mosque cathedral, or cathedral mosque, depending on who you ask, in Cordoba, Spain. It's gorgeous. It's a remarkable structure with a mosque that existed during the golden age of Islam for many hundreds of years before Islam made a turn and the Christians came in, and instead of building a cathedral somewhere else, or instead of tearing the mosque down, they built a cathedral into and up out of the mosque. So the mosque remains and the cathedral is gorgeous. And although this picture maybe shows more of the cathedral than the mosque, it's truly an extraordinary place. And it's made of stone and such. So is it a product of evolution? Well, it's made of stone and wood and other things. Yes, this too is the product of evolution, and this is a place I think Brett will be going to more. So that's some of the surprising, I think, things about where evolutionary thinking takes you, which is that, as I say actually on the Substack that Dr. Blackwood mentioned, natural selections, if it evolved, it's fair game. That's sort of my tagline, which means I guess I'm not supposed to be talking about rocks and galaxies, but I even do that sometimes. But everything else, everything that we think of as a human creation and therefore maybe sort of outside of the zone of evolution is fair game. It's all evolutionary, and that doesn't make it set in stone. That doesn't make it better or worse than those things that aren't evolutionary. It's just a truth. But from that truth, you can then generate some predictions about what will be true of those things. So let's take a step back. This is, as far as we know, the world's first graphical depiction of an evolutionary tree. It's from Darwin's journals in 1837, from after he had returned from his famous voyage on the Beagle. And as the connections began to dawn on him, he drew this branching diagram to suggest relationships and lineage. And he wrote, importantly, if you can see that, I think. In his notes, he wrote, I think. So consider the openness in those two words, the lack of certainty. right? Darwin had all the things. He had insight in combination with the courage to share his insight and the humility to know that everyone's wrong sometimes, and maybe this is his time. I think this is what's going on, and no one else is saying it, and this is big if it's true, but might be wrong. Let's see. Let's pressure test it. Let's put it out there, and it took him a while, but let's put it out there and see what people come back with and see if I can be proven wrong, because that is what scientists should do. Try to prove me wrong. And many people have tried, and many people have improved on or generated more insights beyond what he did, but no one, despite over 150 years now of trying, have managed to prove him wrong. So, this is what evolution is at its simplest: descent with modification. Sometimes that is oversimplified further to change over time. Change over time isn't sufficient, though, because oceans and lakes and shorelines change, and they aren't inherently evolutionary, as do hurricanes and rain showers, and the sun and the moon. The sun didn't evolve, but it changes. So change over time isn't sufficient to explain what evolution is. Those things that I just mentioned, the hurricanes, the sun, the moon, they're abiotic. Those things that are evolutionary are biotic, they are life, and that may be a little bit of a tautology. If it's alive, it's evolution, it's evolved. But that includes, again, to make this point again, trees and forests and coral reefs and sheep and dragonflies and mushrooms and hummingbirds and horses and humans, and everything that is true of us, including many characteristics, that we think of as being uniquely human, but actually, we will see, we'll talk about some tomorrow, we see in other organisms as well, things like joy and grief, pleasure and pain, love and war, and loyalty and creativity. Many of these seem like they're uniquely human characters, but they're not, which is part of what tells us that we aren't the originators, because we didn't teach these things to the other organisms that show them. They came up with them on their own. And so evolution is descent with modification. Like begets like, right? But with each begetting, there are small changes. That's the modification part. Like father, like son, sure. But the son isn't exactly like the father. It's not like gold. Every gold atom is like every other gold atom. Gold is gold across the universe. But life, which hopefully, again, has evolved elsewhere in the universe, will not be the same wherever it evolves. There will be an informational molecule, like we have DNA, that isn't DNA, another place in the universe. So everywhere that life has evolved, it won't be the same, which raises questions about what it means to be the same, which then takes us into the question of what scale of evolution we're most interested in. So I'm going to talk today about the macro scale. What Darwin was intimating with his title, The Origin of Species. Macro in this case refers to large time scales rather than a lot of stuff or a lot of space. So macroevolutionary inquiry seeks to understand historical relationships, whereas most of the stuff that most of us are interested in around how did grief evolve, for instance, is at the smaller scales, and in some ways more interesting. But we're going to spend some time talking about the macroevolutionary, the nature of evidence, because scientists all, including evolutionary biologists, like to make statements and just expect you to believe them. And one of the things that is true of science in general is that you shouldn't take anything on faith. You shouldn't just accept it because I'm up here and I have a PhD. Because there are a lot of people with PhDs who have no idea what they're doing. A lot. So consider this lizard. In nature, one runs into endless forms that cause a person to wonder if you have eyes to see. This is an animal I once knew. This is a lizard, specifically a female chameleon, on Nosy Mangabe, which is a tiny island off the coast of the giant island of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean, where I spent over a year doing field research. over several seasons. And this chameleon lived next to one of the field sites that I spent many, many mornings over several months. I was looking for frogs, and sometimes they didn't show up, and so I watched the chameleon instead, because what are you going to do? So I've told you this is a chameleon. She is a chameleon. Notice her eyes, and notice her feet. Her eyes are unusual for a lizard. She's got, I hope you can see, she's got these big round orbits, and she can rotate her pupils fully in them. And that's, as it turns out, what macroevolutionary biologists have discovered, one of the diagnostic features of chameleons. A lizard who has that is likely to be a chameleon. Notice also the feet. They've got these like mitten, I can't do it because I'm not a chameleon, or like Mork from Mork and Mindy or something. But they've got what's called zygodactyly, to use the jargon, but they've got fused toes, a 2-3 mitten, and they grab onto sticks very well, and it's very hard to get them off if they don't want to be gotten off. Okay, so that's a beautiful chameleon whom I once befriended. This is a chameleon from the same island, held in the hand of a Malagasy man, a naturalist guide, a photograph taken a couple years later by Brett. Perhaps it's too tiny, perhaps you can't see in this picture, but again, notice the eyes, notice the feet. If you can see, and I sort of imagine you can't, and so I'm asking you to take it on faith, the eyes are the same. They have this. They have the ability to rotate entirely in their orbits, and the feet are the same. They have this zygodactyly, these mitten paws. This is a chameleon. Again, yes, but it's a different species than the other one. How do I know? Well, in part, this is an adult, and the people of Madagascar are not inordinately large. Some of the species of chameleons in Madagascar are inordinately small. Like, this is an adult chameleon on the hand of a man who's just a normal-sized man. And that begins to raise questions about why? Like, why so much diversity, and what are we, why is there so much diversity, and who is everyone related to? That's what the macroevolutionary biologists want to know. So we go back to this chameleon, and we ask, are crocodiles more closely related to lizards or birds? So taking a step back further, now we're not talking just about chameleons. Chameleons are in the clade of lizards, and I promise you don't want me to embark on why the evidence for that is true. But if you accept for the moment that lizards exist as a piece of history that is diversified a lot, and chameleons are part of that, and that crocodiles, crocodilians, including caiman and alligator and gharials, exist, and birds exist, that those three groups of organisms exist, and they evolved. There was a radiation, and you have this incredible adaptive radiation out there now of each of these groups, but still, at some point, those organisms didn't exist. Who's more closely related to whom? Well, if you look at the picture, and yes, I picked pictures that make you particularly want to say, well, lizards and crocodiles, right? Lizards and crocodiles must be each other's closest relatives compared to birds, because look at them. The birds don't look anything like the lizards and the crocodiles. But that's not the right answer. And the answer is that birds and crocodiles are actually each other's closest living relatives, if we include extinct organisms, birds and dinosaurs, and then crocodiles. And then outside of that, you have lizards and snakes, and turtles are in there somewhere. We don't even know. We don't know where the turtles go still. So how about seals? Are they more closely related to bears or to whales? Well, here's a bear, here's a whale. We can look at habit. We can look at all of the adaptations that we know, even if we don't know what they exactly are, that allow the whales and the seals to inhabit water the way that they do. And many people will guess it's going to be the seals and the whales that are each other's closest living relatives compared to the bears. And again, that's wrong. Our instinct is wrong. Bears and seals are more closely related to one another than either are to whales. And in fact, whales' closest extant relatives are hippos. Yeah, that's a weird one. But okay, I just made a bunch of claims, right? I just made a bunch of claims about who's related to whom. How do we know? How do we know? Science doesn't operate by authority. You're not supposed to just take my word for it. And sometimes you will, because you don't want to go into all the business of figuring out how the scientists who were doing it figured it out, but that means that I have to prove myself over and over again enough that you can say, like, you are a trustworthy source on this, and I'm gonna let you do the, do the analysis. But still, the epistemological question is foundational. And in evolutionary biology, we have to be aware of it all the time. How is it that we're making our claims of truth? It is not sufficient for me to say, isn't it surprising that bears and seals are more closely related to one another than either are to whales? It is surprising, and that's cool. And we could probably spend a lot of time talking about how cool that is, but you still don't know on what basis I made that claim. Like, what is the nature of the evidence? So for macroevolutionary investigations, again, this long time period where we're trying to figure out the origin of species, the ways that historical relationships exist, like who is related to whom, we care about characters, what laymen would call characteristics, but evolutionary biologists, being intransigent as we are, we insist on calling characters. So I'm probably going to go back and forth between calling them characters and characteristics. But what are characters? Characters are the individual things that change over time, the modifications that happen in that descent with modification. In short, as lineages experience descent, which is to say, as one generation begets another, begets another, begets another, what are the modifications that occur? What are the characters that you can look at and say, that thing changed? It was 100 years, actually, after Darwin first published his work that evolutionary biologists were gifted with the thinking, the insight of a German entomologist named Willy Hennig, who was the first to recognize that taking a Gestalt-level view of these things was not going to be sufficient. And so what had been happening up until then, as biologists were accepting what Darwin had said, but we're still having a very hard time figuring out who was related to whom, they'd see in the distance, or maybe not in the distance, but a legless organism and be like, it kind of looks like a snake. It's probably a snake, right? And kind of squint and not take too many measurements, and it would be fine. Except it wasn't, because the Gestalt level understanding of things often isn't right, and it ends up telling you things like lizards and crocodiles are more closely related to each other than they are to birds, and whales and seals must be more closely related to each other than they are to bears. And if you actually start drilling down to get more precise, looking at characters, you find that the Gestalt doesn't do well by you. So with regard to this picture, an intentionally out of focus picture that I took on the Oregon coast a few years back, what do you see? It's a bird, right? See anything else? Not anything else. Any guesses as to what kind of bird? Yeah, I heard it. Someone said, I think, a crow. So I am here to attest that that is in fact a crow. Because I was there, I took the picture, which is not a good picture, well, it's an artsy picture, right? It's not a clear picture, it's not a picture that an ornithologist would want to see, right? But I was there with the organism, and I spent a lot of time around crows, and I spent a lot of time thinking about the characters that go into defining what makes a crow, and I can assure you that what I was seeing when I took a picture of was a crow. But if you were to just show me the picture and I hadn't been there and I hadn't taken the picture, I can't tell for sure. So what are you cueing on? It's like it's the primaries, the feathers, the way he's flying, the blackness of him, but maybe he's just in shadow. There are a number of things that we're all carrying around with us that we have in our heads about what makes an organism, but mostly we're not conscious of it. How about this one? What's that? It's a shark. Yeah, it turns out it's a nurse shark in the Bahamas. Again, sort of an intentionally muddy picture that I took and am sharing with you because for this one, I think unlike the previous one, where people are like, yeah, it's definitely a bird, but I don't know what kind of a bird maybe. Maybe it's a crow. This one, shark, right? So why? What are you seeing? What do you know? What is it that's in your head, that's in your subconscious, that is allowing you to look at this, like there's almost no detail here. All you've got is a silhouette, and to say shark. Well, one thing is that tail shape, which in biology jargon is called heterocircle, where the top half of the tail is far different in size from the bottom half, is an unusual shape of tail for marine vertebrates. Now, if you think, I swear to God, I have never had an opinion about the tails of marine vertebrates. How would I possibly know that that was a rare thing? Well, maybe some part of you has been. knowing that, in part because shark is something that everyone wants to know, right? Shark is one of those, on Earth, universals. It's not a universal like gold is, but that you should be able to recognize at a distance and know something about, right? So although probably almost no one in the room has thought to themselves, yes, I have a model of what the tails of marine vertebrates look like in general, and that's not what they usually look like, still that was probably playing into your recognition that this is a shark. So what are the kinds of characteristics that we use? They are, broadly speaking, 4 types of evidence that macroevolutionary biologists use. They are, let's see if I can read it, molecular, morphological, developmental, which is to say, ontogenetic through the development of an individual life, and behavioral. I'm going to talk more about behavioral characteristics tomorrow, but also there's actually a 5th one that is super fascinating, and we're not going to talk about here because it's mostly about languages, but a 5th rarely used, symbolic. So symbols evolve too, and it is possible to generate phylogenies of languages, and they are fascinating. And anyone who speaks of Indo-European languages or any of the other language families knows that we can interpret relationships. So I'm going to just quickly go through these first 3, molecular, morphological, developmental, as an indicator of what is the kind of evidence that evolutionary biologists are using when you then will see a tree saying, or a claim, you know what, bears and seals are more closely related than whales. Really? How did you get there? Well, the biologists probably used a combination, we hope, of molecular, morphological, developmental, and behavioral characteristics to get there. So this is the best slide. I could spend time on genetic sequences with each of the 4 letters representing one of the 4 nitrogenous bases found in DNA, G for guanine, A for adenine, T for thymine, and C for cytosine. In the human genome, there are about 3.1 billion base pairs. That's billion with a B. It's a lot of data. It's really tedious. It's not interesting to anyone, but it's a lot of data. And so the molecular revolution that happened in biology starting, about when we were in grad school in the 90s, made it possible to suddenly generate a huge amount of data. Like, oh, we've just got all of these genomic sequences and we can just plug them into a machine and honestly cross our fingers and hope that it does the right thing, and it's going to spit some stuff back out at us, and we're going to say, now we have relationships. There are many reasons to be concerned about using only molecular data, but I'm also not going to talk any more about it because no one is as interested, honestly, as in looking at that as in looking at this, right? So this is phenotype. That was genotype. This is phenotype. That wasn't the genotype of a mountain lion. I tried to find one, I couldn't. That's just a random set of, probably doesn't code for anything. But the phenotypic characters of organisms, those things that are expressed by the genome, include things like gills, jaws, and wings, and brains. And it gets fractal. You can say, okay, brains. Okay, well then, let's measure parts of brains. Let's measure relative parts of brains, margins within brains, where nervous tissue goes, what it's connected to, how many branches it has. All of these are plausible characters that biologists can use when they're trying to infer history, which is what this game is we're trying to infer history. So to an evolutionary biologist who thinks in deep time, the kind who is just trying to discover relationships between organisms, you want to observe at all of these levels, if you can. All these levels, all these scales in both space and time. So here we have 3 beautiful animals: a dragonfly, a bird, a lemur. This is a shafak, a type of lemur in Madagascar. None of these are my photographs. And an evolutionary biologist looks at this and says, those are beautiful, but those 2, the wings on those 2, those aren't the same thing. They're both wings, okay, I get that, and they're both being used to a similar function, but the most recent common ancestor of dragonflies and birds didn't have wings. And indeed, they didn't have limbs. The most recent common ancestor of birds and dragonflies didn't have limbs at all. It wasn't a vertebrate. It didn't have bilateral symmetry, probably. And so the wings evolved separately in these two organisms, which is really interesting to those of us who are interested in convergence and adaptation and why things look the way they do. But it's less interesting to those who are trying to infer history and trying to figure out, is that the same thing or is it not? These two wings are not the same thing from a macroevolutionary perspective. In comparison, the limbs of this lemur, a primate, and the wings of this bird are, from an evolutionary perspective, the same thing. Because the most recent common ancestor of mammals and birds was a reptile that had limbs. It was a tetrapod. And even though these limbs have changed dramatically, they are still, by one measure, the same thing. And we can do this a little bit more. All of these are forelimbs of tetrapods. Forelimbs, just the front limbs of tetrapods, the four-footed vertebrates that came onto land, made a go of it, and occasionally went back. Whales, seals, sea snakes. But they came onto land and they mostly made a go of it up here, including us. So all of the forelimbs in these pictures are homologous, but this gets confusing because we've got a bat and a couple of birds up here, and bats and birds both have tetrapod forelimbs, which are the same in evolutionary space, but the way that they've made their wings are not. So birds make wings out of their entire arm, and bats, and you can kind of see it in this picture, the Latin for bat is chiroptera, bats have hand wings. And so even though the forelimbs of all these organisms are the same at some evolutionary level that is useful for evolutionary biologists who are trying to infer history, it is also true that the wings of bats and birds are not the same. And you can tell that by looking at the characters of things like the bones and the muscles that make up the wings themselves and the flight muscles. So I guess one more thing about forelimbs. All of the tetrapods, including us, have this one-to-many organization in both forelimbs and hind limbs. We got up above, for us, humerus, radius and ulna, and all the tarsals and metatarsals, carpals and metacarpals. And in the legs, it's femur, tibia, fibula, and a bunch of bones down there. That's the tarsals and metatarsals. But that's true for all the tetrapods, unless they've lost them, or they're horses and they've driven it down to one toe, or they're snakes and they don't have any of it at all. They're still tetrapods though, because they're still part of that history. So there are even more difficult to visualize instantiations of the same thing. This is not going to be the most beautiful picture you're going to see today, but it's part of a fascinating story. So this is a lamprey. Lampreys are, depending on who you ask, either early vertebrates or sort of the latest living non-vertebrates. But they're vertebrate-ish, for sure. And they have, you can count on the side there, those holes in the side of his head are actually gill slits. Those are respiratory structures, and they are, there's no bone in these guys, they're cartilaginous. And the gill slits, which is the holes through which they breathe, are supported by gill arches, which are skeletal, but in their case, cartilaginous, not bony, gill arches. And they don't have jaws. Lampreys have no jaws. Sharks have jaws, and they have gill arches, but count the gill arches on these guys. They don't look the same, but they look like these folds on the side of that shark. And there is one shark in existence that has 6 gills. It's called the six-gilled shark. But all the rest of the sharks out there have five gills, and correspondingly 5 gill slits. The architecture, the skeletal architecture associated with the gill slits. So where'd the other ones go? Well, the other ones, one of them became the jaws. And that's still our jaws. The foremost, or again, depending on who you ask, because it's hard to decipher history from hundreds of millions of years ago, and disagreements are real and don't mean that we're entirely on the wrong path, but they do mean that we don't know for sure exactly what's true. Either the first or the second gill slit of lampreys became, or the long ago ancestor of lampreys became the jaws of sharks, and then went on to become the jaws of the rest of us as well. But then over time, more things changed. And so sharks also have no bone. Sharks are entirely made of cartilage. They have teeth, which are very, very hard material, obviously, as hard as our bone, but they have no bone in their skeleton. And so their jaws are still cartilaginous as well. Fast forward a couple 100 million years, and you get bunnies and other mammals. And we have jaws, of course, but some of our jaws are made up of different bones than the cartilage part of the shark's jaws. Things have been moving around in our heads. And one thing that mammals have that no one that came before us do is these 3 middle ear bones that allow us to hear very high frequencies. Reptiles that aren't mammals only have 1 middle ear bone. It too came from one of the first gill arches of the lamprey. The remaining 2 middle ear bones that allow us to have such amazing hearing, it is part of how it is that mammals have spread so wide and far over the world, come from the jaws of the shark, which came from the gill arches of the lamprey. So the gill arches of the lamprey, the jaws of the shark, the middle ear bones of mammals, they're all the same in macroevolutionary language because we can track. And again, and here we'll get just a tiny bit into ontogeny, the developmental story. We can track through development how these things have changed, both through individual development and we can infer through evolutionary time. So there's a famous saying in biology, promoted by Ernst Haeckel in the early 19th century, that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That means development repeats evolutionary history. The problem is that it's not true. It's not by most measures or in most situations true. And it suggests a kind of clockwork universe, hence the background that I have here, which was popular at the time, a very kind of a mechanistic understanding of the universe, but that doesn't make it true. So, okay, if ontogeny doesn't recapitulate phylogeny, if that's not generally what happens, what is what happens? Well, it's not as pithy. It doesn't have quite as nice a ring to it. But instead, what we have is, and this is maybe the founder of embryology, von Baer, in 1828, says, embryos progressively differentiate away from a more common embryological plan. And this image is a little bit hard to interpret because the evolutionary tree is sort of coming up from the bottom and the developmental time is coming down from the top and they're meeting in the middle. But the point is that the early embryos at the top, regardless of which species they are being described for, all kind of look the same. That early in, right after fertilization, and for some amount of time, depending on how long you are before you are born or hatched or whatever it is that happens to you, you pretty much look just like a tiny little embryo, at least if you're a vertebrate. Things look different over in invertebrate space. And then as time progresses, you come to look more and more like your future self and less like that vague general plan. So that means, in part, that we can use development, that we can use embryology and looking at different stages of development in various animals to have another route into inferring history. So far we have talked about the molecules, the molecular evidence, the morphological evidence, and I didn't say anything about fossils, but that's included in morphological evidence, characters from fossils, developmental evidence. We haven't said anything about behavior, but we'll get to that tomorrow. So when we're looking at organisms and trying to figure out how they came to be the way they are and whom they might be related to, you have all of these things: molecules, morphology, development, behavior, depending on what you're looking at, maybe symbols if you're looking at human creations. And the strongest hypothesis for relationship, in terms of, again, if the game here, and this is not the game that all evolutionary biologists are trying to play, and indeed not the one that we're going to be talking about for most of the rest of our talks here, but if the game is who's related to whom, how do I infer history? Because evolutionary biology is distinct among sciences, like geology, in being an historical science. History does not, in fact, repeat itself, and so you have to go back in and make inferences, and you cannot say, well, what if we make that happen again? It's like, you can't make that happen again. The dire wolf is not back, right? You can't make it happen again. So what you want, preferentially, is to not have the gene jocks, as those of us who aren't gene jocks call them, to just come in and do all the sequencing and get lots of molecules and have all the molecular evidence and say, I built a tree, I built a hypothesis of evolutionary relationship, this evolutionary tree based entirely on molecules, and here it is. What we prefer is if there are also some morphological characters in there, and maybe some developmental characters, maybe behavioral characters, because we want is consilience. And you can't have consilience between different kinds of evidence if you only have one kind of evidence. And it's the kind of mistake that the reductionist, mechanistic, number-heavy, data-driven, pseudo, if I may, scientific investigations that many are involved in now are making. That, I figured out the way, and this is the only thing we're going to need, and it's going to provide the answer. And that is so often not actually going to result in a correct answer. So tomorrow I'm going to take us into the land of behavior a bit and talk about a number of other characters. But before I cede the floor to Brett for tonight, I want to say one more thing. We've talked about a number of different organisms here today. Here's a landscape from the American painter Thomas Cole from Massachusetts. The painting is of Massachusetts. We can say, wow, there's so much diversity, so much life. Considering it all, one might ask, and many have, why? And also, which one's best? Do the fittest actually survive? And if so, what makes an organism most fit? And how can we all get there? Right? And of course, there have been many who have imagined that they can get there, and they know what the answer is. Best must mean strongest, right? Or maybe biggest, or loudest, or richest, most successful in the marketplace, most powerful on the world stage. That must be what fittest means. But it's not. It's not. Fitness is really about, well, actually, Brett asked me to save that for him. So Brett's going to talk about fitness a little bit. But regardless, there's no static answer. There can't be, because everything changes. Change happens, and therefore there cannot be a universal best no matter what. There's not going to be a single way to be best because the world is constantly changing. So given your particular sets of strengths and weaknesses, you may be on top at the moment, and that could change in a minute. And what this does in part is puts the lie to, well, of course, the social Darwinists and the eugenicists and the utopians of every sort, honestly, who are aiming for a perfect world that doesn't change. Because that's not going to be possible. Evolution is a response to change, and of course it creates change of its own, and it creates non-universal solutions that are really great for the here and now, and then some of those really great for the here and now solutions actually manage to last a long time. We still have crocodiles. We've had crocodiles on this planet for hundreds of millions of years. That's incredible. Birds are pretty new, all of them, and there's thousands of them. And they're changing all the time. So are we. So it's interesting to think about which forms are actually really sticky, like really do work over time and have managed to last, and which are changing constantly. But crocodiles aren't best, even though they're really, really good at what they're doing. What would that mean? Change is always happening. So selection and evolution continue on in part because they are operating on the change that the environment is providing it. It creates organisms who are operating on the environment. And I'm going to talk tomorrow about some of those organisms, but Brett is now going to talk to you about some of them as well. All right, thank you.